Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth of 5 Tecnoglass lectures in the spring series. I'm Joel Lemire, curator of this series and director of the graduate programs in architecture here at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Sean Canty joining us to discuss his work and its context. Two things before I even start the introduction, though. First, a bit of bureaucracy. For those seeking AIA continuing education units for this lecture, please email our coordinator, Stephen Fett, at sfett@miami.edu. Second, though, and much more importantly, actually, we need to thank our series sponsor, Tecnoglass. They have been incredibly generous in supporting this series year in and year out. By allowing us to bring in so many amazing designers and thinkers, Tecnoglass has directly contributed to the growth of our intellectual culture here at USOA. Once again, thank you, Tecnoglass. So now let me introduce Sean Canty. In curating this series titled Operating in Material Conditions Architectural Imaginaries, I was quite literal with most of my picks. Earlier speakers, Virginia Sanfratello, Felicia Davis, and Brandon Clifford, originate their research in physical matter and operate through it as a primary medium for architectural form. You could say much the same of our upcoming speaker, Philippe Bloch. But this evening, with Sean Canty, we depart from the literal reading of material as physical matter in favor of a more abstract usage. The material conditions at play here are instead disciplinary matter, those fundamental chunks of knowledge that undergird the spatial disciplines. Material is one of those, to be sure, but in Sean's work, there's also a sustained preoccupation with type and geometry. In fact, it was with Sean in mind that I snuck a couple of sentiments into my description for the lecture series. So I'll read one line from that, quote, material reconstruction operates along many axes: production, composition, geometric deployment, form, and structure, end quote. So when it comes to questions of geometric deployment and form, very few architects are even in league with Sean Canty. I credit this sophistication in part to how he has suffused his design work with both the language and processes associated with descriptive geometry. This dedication to geometry buttresses his forms, which in turn managed to avoid the many fashionable but vacuous attempts to assert meaning in so many of his contemporaries. Sean's forms are not overtly computational. They forego the ease of the algorithmic and the parametric, but they also don't swing wildly toward the various reactionary strains of the anti-digital. They are not reducible to pure reference or analogy or any of the semiotic games that the podigs seem to love. They are not mashups or provocations or pig's ears. They are instead resolved compositions, crafted spaces. And this is not to say the work of Studio Sean Canty is any less peculiar or surprising than these. On the contrary, the radical possibility suggested by these projects resides precisely in this dedicated spatial crafting. Geometry is obviously a long-standing and essential apparatus for both understanding and producing form. So I have invited Sean Canty today because his work represents among the best evidences of the enduring value of this as an apparatus. I thought we should all see it. In my mind, I've already laid out some of what Sean Canty's accomplished, but the bona fides actually add a lot, as it turns out, so I'll run through those quickly. Sean Canty is founder of the aforementioned Studio Sean Canty and co-founder of Office 3. Through these practices, he's been exhibited widely, including at MoMA, selected as a finalist for both the 2016 PS1 competition and 2020 Times Square Heart competition, and completed a timber pavilion at Governor's Island. He is equally engaged in academia and pedagogy, currently as an assistant professor at Harvard's GSD, though he has taught and lectured in many places. And I won't list all of the accolades and publications, but we'll point to a couple upcoming ones, including one in blank, Speculations on CLT, and Inscriptions, Architecture Before Speech. So, long story short, I'm so glad that we were able to convince Sean to come join us this evening. He is missing out on a lovely, rainy 42-degree night in Boston right now, so that must be very disappointing. I can't wait to hear him. So on behalf of USOA and Tecnoglass, please join me in welcoming Sean Canty. I'll get rid of the got it thing here.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Joel. It's great to be in Miami. It's also great to be amongst friends. and back in Miami, and in this space. I see it all the time on social media, and it's a dream to be here. It's kind of awkward and weird and lovely. And of course, my first in-person lecture, I bring the anxiety of New York City through Miami in an Uber. But I'm happy to be here to share some of my work. And I titled this talk, Typical Forms in Atypical Houses, to one, talk about the relationship between form and typology and how that's very present in the work. And this question of typicality versus exception. As Joel mentioned, I have two parallel practices, Studio SC and Office of 3. They complement each other. My collaboration with Stephanie Lin and Ryan Golenberg is a kind of alternative form of practice where it's an extension of our friendship, but also our shared interest in both form, geometry, and questions around the social, but also a way of celebrating ideological and difference. And the studio has worked on a kind of range of projects over the course of the 5 years that it's been operating, from, let's say, pavilions to single-family dwellings, to thinking about multi-family dwellings, to large-scale collective housing, and trying to find opportunities to interrelate the abstractions of form or of geometry with certain conditions of typology, either as a kind of spatial organizer or sometimes the image of type. And how both of these two things intersect to kind of frame spaces that are social in some sense. So there's a kind of spectrum of projects that I've been working on, some that are in the realm of speculations, some that are pavilions, which I call kind of proto-architectures, and then buildings. And I just wanted to also get started because the speculations and pavilions are quite important, but also there's a kind of mode of working in the practice that really centers this idea of tangency as a way of one, literally kind of going off on a tangent and coming back to, let's say, a kind of core idea, or finding continuity between different aspects of the work or different aspects of the discipline. So in the case of how, let's say, two shapes, let's say in the case of Ellsworth Kelly, share a point, or in the case of Karabov, the ways in which different kinds of effects of sculptural bodies kiss or touch. Or Ron Resch, the ways in which two self-similar geometries and this technique of tangent folding where these two cones share a point, or the ways in which tangency is used to kind of produce new kinds of formal configurations and postures. And then the ways in which tangency can be produced to produce piecewise continuity, or the ways in which, let's say, curves or surfaces can be stitched together to produce new compositions. And so I would say maybe the kind of substrate to all of this thinking is what I call, at least in the practice, typical geometries for me, because these are recurrent figures or a recurrent cast of figures that I'm constantly using to kind of work on to produce new techniques, but also to leverage their formal and spatial and geometric potential to think about unconventional organizations of typologies. So these are a class of geometries called Developables, the generalized cylinder, cone, the tangent developable, and the plane, which most of architecture is produced and made from. And I have a particular interest, and I know Joel as well, and some of our other friends with the cone, because it has a particular history within the canon of architecture, or developables have a particular lineage in the canon of architecture as ways of rationalizing more complicated surfaces and geometries for construction. And that's because of two things. Their ability to kind of unroll flat, this kind of isometric condition, but also I like to call the adjacency of curves that are embodied in the geometry itself. And that's the circular section in one direction and a series of straight sections in the other direction. That allows for the form to bend in very particular ways, but also to be amenable to flatness or more conventional organizations of space. And perhaps a precedent that kind of always lingers with me is this precedent that I discovered as a grad student in The Projective Cast by Robin Evans in the chapter Drawn Stone, where he articulates a story around this study that was produced by the architect and geometer Philibert Delorme. And there was no space in the plan of the existing hotel to produce the study, and therefore it had to engage the corner. So it's a very peculiar condition because it's so miniature. It's a miniature piece of architecture compared to the hotel and in the space of that courtyard. And it also, there's a kind of paradox in terms of the scale. There's a paradox in terms of a room engaging a corner on the outside. To see a room in this way is kind of weird. And then the one that I like the most is, this is the plan, are these two drawings by Robin Evans, who reconstructs this process and beautifully renders this condition by which the conical arch structurally supports the tower of the study above and dives into the surface of the existing corner. And so it reads as both on the top part of the composition as an additive condition, but beneath it, it is subtractive. And that both of these perceptual readings can be, in one proposition. And that is in part through, well, there's a third thing. And my speculation is that the reason why this is called Drawn Stone is not only because of the chapter is called Drawn Stone, not only because of the use of projection or the use of unrolling in order to kind of organize material in the realm of the flatness or on the flat plane, but also the way in which the architect treats the edge of the study. It looks like a drawing that is in here, that's been sketched in here. And it's a sketchiness that I love so much. But also this condition of both building both additive and subtractive or both and. And so we kind of love finding these kind of anachronistic strategies of dealing with form and geometry and studying them and looking at them on their own terms, and then seeing if they have applications in some of the work that we might be doing. And so in this case, we produced a series of corner conditions of ourselves that are misbehaved in other ways, where we kind of rub out cylinders into the flatness of a surface. So we scale them in weird ways. We double them up, we pair one and single out the other, or we have a kind of double scoop at the top and bottom. And this was a kind of final drawing produced in 2D, which tries to kind of begin to kind of suggest the kind of material organization to those forms, and was submitted to an exhibition at the CC in San Francisco called Drawing Codes. And so part of the research was actually like looking at the kind of codes that Delorme was operating with at the time, and he's kind of using knowledge both in the realm of architecture, but also in the realm of stonemasons to produce that exceptional condition. And then we also, we do these kind of formal digressions as a side to the ongoing work, as a way of thinking about, or thinking in a very disciplined way, how to engage form, but also to kind of find ways of relaxing it too, in a very disciplined way as well. So trying to be both rigorous and casual at the same time. And so, a project we're currently working on now for a gallery in New York City, where we're thinking about this question of development at the scale of an object or a piece of furniture. And this is the Swirly Stool and Table, where two semicircular in different scale size circles are sharing a seam, and at that seam produces a fold that then turns into a vertical that supports the stool and the table. And then using color to highlight that moment between the transition between the flat and the vertical, or the horizontal and the vertical, as a part of the playing into the ambiguity between that transition. And a lot of the constraint is trying to get these things to constantly not self-intersect when they roll down into the flat plane, but that they maintain some logic of tangency in the unrolled state, so that they can be made from a single sheet of material, in this case, sheet metal. This is just a different version of that. Last summer, we also had the opportunity of participating in an exhibition called Not for Construction. As you can imagine, that's exactly the theme of the exhibit, was to think about modes of drawing and representation that's not an output as architecture as a service, but that you would get to the client or contractor, but more as a kind of intellectual conjecture. And in the project, in the office, and in the work, you'll see that there's always a kind of ambiguity between horizontal and vertical surfaces. I kind of classify them as cups or hinges or folds that kind of blend different typological conditions and make them ambiguous. And so we produced 3 silkscreen prints that took 3 of our pavilion projects and explored this idea of a hinge as a kind of representational device, where we were combining two drawing projections. So let's say on the case on the left, a kind of elevation oblique, the worm's eye oblique, and in the middle, a kind of worm's eye and bird's eye, and the right, a kind of elevation oblique, but with the form kind of turned upside down. And that was a fun process because we also, these were silk screen, and so there was also a kind of process of producing the drawings that at the moment of the hinge, that the solid void relationship would also flip. It's a little hard to tell here digitally, but there's a kind of reversal or inversion of what's white versus black at that slip. So I'll move into some of the building projects, and I'll start with the Janus House. And this was this house, the Concord House, and the Folly Pavilion were kind of done in series, and I kind of like working that way. They kind of delve into or think very thoughtfully about a limited set of concerns. And in this case, was thinking about the ways in which we might consider densifying suburban lots and revisiting typologies that aren't only single family housing, but thinking about how could we think about alternative ways of living together. And so here the Janus House tries to kind of conjoin 2 single family homes into one architectural volume. And in the process, we were kind of playing on questions of typology. So we were revisiting a kind of southern type of a shed called the dog trot, where you have two twin gables that are separated by an open breezeway. And it's very axial as a typology. And the breezeway is kind of performative to kind of cool the house in kind of hotter conditions. And then the courtyard, which can be three-sided or rectangular or circular, but the courtyard is always, it has a perimeter and it has a center. And so how could we conflate these two logics into one house? And so we start with the dog trot, and we inscribe a circular courtyard at the axis of the gable, and we kind of fold the dog trot on itself so that it encloses that space of the courtyard, and the two sides of the house kind of pinch together. And even though there's some apparent symmetry, there's slightly some asymmetrical things that happen between the left and right side of the plan. And private and public functions are the darker half is more public things that are closer to the entrance, and then the private living spaces are towards the back. And we looked at historical precedents of twins. We actually had a whole catalog of mini twins within architecture. Twins and triplets are actually kind of funny when you think about symmetry or seriality as kind of both formal devices, but typological families. And the Piazza di Popolo is an interesting one because even though from the piazza, the two churches look pretty identical, their plans are slightly different. And in part, maybe because one singular architect did not author both of the churches, it was a kind of ongoing process that happened over time. So that could be one reason, but we could also attribute that to perhaps site. And so one has a circular, it's kind of more of a centralized church, and the other one has an elliptical plan, and so it's more axial. And so, you can say that more axial things are more, the axial church is more connected to the piazza, the centralized one is more inward looking. And so we were just thinking about that as studying, like, how can you set up, some continuities between the sides, and then how you can make minor and subtle differences in the plan to both accommodate two different kinds of subjects, but also to think about the kind of flexibility of the typological setup. We make lots of big scale models. Here we were kind of trying to think about the ways in which the entry was produced. And we ended up settling on a kind of conical awning that connects the two doorways. And actually, this may have slipped down a little bit, but it was hitting the valley of the two gables before. And so there's a kind of like sense of familiarity on the front of the house, but a kind of plasticness when you turn around the back. And so we were also thinking about how can we maintain this degree of abstractness through normative use materials. So we were looking at kind of standing seam, siding and roof, but thinking about kind of differentiating tone and sheen and matteness or finish to register some difference between the base and the roof, but also to kind of allow the house to kind of stand out in the kind of greenery of the landscape of the lot. And then this is a view that centers the subject kind of right at the fold between the two sides. And here we can see how the two bedrooms kind of look out onto that centralized courtyard. So the next project is called the Folly Pavilion. It was a project that we looked at to think about how can we look at vernacular and normative construction methods to produce curvature. And in this case, we were looking at the ways in which contractors or tradesmen build turrets through standard 2x lumber, and speculated on what happens if we blew that process up, made it bigger. But instead of the turret being exposed, what happens if we hide it inside of a shed? And so here's a section of that kind of game of hide and seek between the turret and the conical turret in the shed. The plan is rather simple, and the program is very simple. It's a kind of outdoor gathering space, and it needed a place for sitting, a place for cooling, and a place for performance. And so we started with a simple diagram of 4 pinwheeling walls that would support the dome above, and then slightly tweaking that or rotating that so that we can instill some degree of hierarchy between the sides. So, in just that subtle rotation, we now get something that is scaled like a door on the right side of the plan. 2 large openings, one that is slightly oblique, and then another kind of awkward entry from the left. And so just through that kind of, we did a bunch of studies of just kind of twerking the diagram to see what kinds of approximations of thresholds that we could get: door, window, big window, small window, without much effort. This is the final plan. So the black circle in the middle was meant to be a kind of reflecting pool that can be covered up and function as a stage. There's a small space for seating, and then the four different openings. And so as you move around the pavilion, you are seeing and viewing sometimes the shed and sometimes the dome. There's like a kind of game of peekaboo that happens where the shed is coplanar with the surface of the cone through tangent planes, and then sometimes the cone kind of pulls away and tucks in, animating the facade. And so here you can see the ways in which those 2 geometries are entangled from the roof plan, and that's made evident by on one side the cone kind of carving away at the shed, on the other side the shed allowing the cone to kind of enter into this rectangular threshold. And on the other side, this is manifested through 2 sibling oculis or openings that are to kind of bring daylight into the plan below. And this is a moment, or kind of an ambiguous moment, where I call a kind of tuck, where the gable begins to kind of tuck into the interior of the cone, or the cone kind of folds out into the gable. And that was done through this process of flattening and unrolling and trying to reinscribing those geometries, or drawing those geometries on the surface of the cone, and then projecting it back up into the folded condition, or the formed condition, I should say. And so it maintains a kind of sense of abstraction. Obviously, you can see here we were playing with thinking about material siding, or theme bending wood siding to play with kind of, to be a play on vernacular materials, but in the end we end up kind of thinking about something much more abstract and mute to play up that ambiguity between the 2 forms. And so it feels like a kind of small house on the outside, but on the inside, you know, through the kind of concavity on the underside of the cone, it feels monumental. And so there's a kind of like play on scale between the inside and outside that is quite surprising. And then here we can see that moment where the two fold into each other to bring the light into the center. And so those kind of ideas around development, continuity and discontinuity in Folly Pavilion really informed the study of thinking about stealth density on a suburban lot in Concord, Massachusetts, and deploying the conical hinge at a different scale. In this case, it's actually at a much larger scale, and thinking about how it could be used to separate and connect two wings of a house, one that has a two-story residence and one that has two flats on the other side. And that the space in the center would be a commons that would allow for the renters to have a larger space to engage with each other, as well as with the family that owns the single family house. So we looked at different kinds of tangent studies of jostling the wings around the circle. And then it's inscribing a circle inside of a kind of bent form. Actually, I shouldn't say inscribing, but using the circle to actually negotiate the particularities of the site, which was actually, it's the site that's on the Courtyard Block. You can tell it's a kind of trapezoidal site. One edge is here, one edge is there, and the circular commons allows for one wing of the house to kind of sweep or rotate around and be parallel to the other lot edge. This is the plan. So you can see the two-story residence on the left with its own internal staircase, a one-story flat on the right, and then the commons in the center. Here's the upper level of the two-story residence, and then on the right, a kind of smaller flat. And in this case, there's a kind of maybe a dialectic between the smoothness of one side of the house and the kind of coarseness or chunkiness on the other side of the house because of that site condition of the bend. And as a way of thinking about how to engage those two languages or those two, let's say, opposites, we, versus in the Folly house or the Folly Pavilion where there's one single cone, here we stitched two cones together and slid them down a seam to produce an opening for skylight that allows light into the commons. That has been kind of situated inside of a normative gable. This is a kind of, a view inside the commons of the staircase that's leading up to the mezzanine level, but you can see that crack or that fold in the surface above that kind of funnels light into the center. So the front of the house is mostly abstract and has very little openings or windows, but around the back, it's much more punctuated. And that oblique skylight, well, it's the only oblique condition, but it participates in that language of openings on the back side, or that kind of porosity, the difference between the front and the back. Okay, this was a project that this was a research project that we did last summer that ended up being in an exhibition at the Royal Academy. It's called House Block Commons. And it's a project that is situated in Philadelphia in the Cobbs Creek neighborhood. And here we were exploring questions of collective housing, of climate and resiliency, and of questions of social justice, which hadn't really been a preoccupation of the practice until we did some research on this site. This site once housed a group called Move. They were a group of a group that at the time was seen as radical. I think some of their ideas probably would not be as so radical today. Really different ideas of communality, of a different idea of our relationship to the earth, to landscape, how we eat, and very much anti-capital, anti-government, and therefore had some conflicts, not only with the local authorities, but with their middle-class Black neighbors. This ended badly for everybody, I say, because in trying to capture one of the leaders of the group, the Philadelphia Police Department razed the entire block. And what was meant to be a kind of isolated extraction ended up damaging the entirety of the neighborhood and the community. And so this is the kind of remnants after the bombing. And this was the site when it was cleared. And the city had built back housing, but it wasn't very good housing or as good as it was before. And so therefore it still kind of carried the scars of the original atrocity. And, you know, we were trying to think about these three questions on the table. You know, how does questions of social justice, how does questions of thinking about climate and resiliency in urban areas also intersect with our kind of housing crisis. And so we proposed a kind of alternative imaginary for the block, and we thought about it at three scales: the house, the block, and the commons. And we were also looking at both the relationship between wealth and, let's say, heat islands within the city. And so the green space is wealthier areas, and they are significantly cooler than those that are in red or yellow, where most people of color reside. And so we collaborated with the engineering firm AKT and London to do a series of climate analysis in correlation with our development of a new housing proposal. We're also very interested in thinking typologically in a different way than previously, and trying to think about the kind of street wall and the way in which the street wall is kind of pours from street to house, through a kind of yard, a podium that houses the basement underneath, a stoop, and a porch, and then a kind of shared entry that's covered by this the pediment, and the kind of variety and texture of the individual rooms as you look down the block. And so this was the site before the bombing, the site after the bombing, the subpar reconstruction. And we decided to do a series of block compositions to think about how can we bring back the density of the block that was formerly there, and how can we also integrate strategies of green space to cool the block and also make it more resilient, as it will be more prone to flooding during storm surges. A lot to take on, but this is a study we're exploring breaking the street wall and kind of checkerboarding the open space, really amplifying that sensibility. And then at some point we decided maybe it's not a good idea to build back at the site of the atrocity, and maybe it's better to leave it as a void space. And maybe that void space might be an opportunity to think about how we could tackle some of our climate desires. So this was a kind of the Courtyard Block, which maintains some degree of the street wall, some degree of entry to the center, and preserves the original site. Here we kind of angled the street wall a bit for daylighting and shading purposes, but we have the street cutting through the courtyard. And here we decided to enclose it again and allow it to be a space of recreation, but also a space that could tackle some of these issues of climate through landscape. And so we did a series of analysis of the proposal of, if we have more greenery versus less greenery, the tilt, these are just a few kind of outputs of that. And eventually arrived on, these particular angles and this particular organization where we have a space of recreation and a space of leisure at the center of the block, but also kind of maintaining a sense of the void that was once there. And then a series of housing that combines both single family homes, duplexes and triplexes to kind of re-densify in those two bars. And we produced a series of drawings. This one in particular, which was exhibited at the Royal Academy, in which we were looking at the front and back of our new proposed housing type and thinking about how can we, one, articulate a material, our material proposal, which we were looking at mass timber that's been cladded with brick. And then also how can we articulate the kind of social life of the block that we imagined through the line drawing. And then trying to kind of bring back some of those typological elements of the porch, the stoop, and the yard. And I don't know if you noticed in the Google image, but there's a kind of typologically a kind of like a porch that's outside, and sometimes there are porches that are enclosed. And the kind of integration of the enclosed porch and some setback also got us to think about what are the ways in which we might begin to kind of think about terraces, which are a little uncommon in that city, but could allow some relationship to the green space for owners and renters that are on the backside of the block. And also reducing the fenestration to kind of control fuel poverty and increasing the height of the podium to try to think about storm surges and flooding. So very simple moves, but hopefully with maximum impact. These were the plans of the housing types. Along the party wall, there's a kind of rotated light well that allows for kind of chance glimpses of your neighbors across the way, but also a way of kind of insulating the space and bringing daylight to a kind of a particularly deep plan. We did lots of models. In this case, this was a digital one where we were looking at the relationship of the facade in relationship to the composition of the block, and then a series of images to kind of think about the quality of material and light and the street and the kind of perforated street wall of our proposal. And then this is the backside of the block and the space of the commons. And then that's the model there at the exhibit in the front. And I think, how am I on time? Good, okay. So, that was a really exciting project to kind of think at a kind of larger scale and to think about the ways in which type and form are also, trying to kind of reorchestrate the social, particularly in the case where the social life of the block was no longer there, and trying to think about questions of climate. In this project, we were working on a single family home and thinking about the ways in which, in I'll say New York, the ways in which a space of work could be integrated into the space of domesticity. This is called the Barrel House, and we were really interested in a kind of simple diagram of two barrel vaults that kiss at the center, but that organizes the kind of spine through the house. And that the house in plan and then the roof plan kind of oscillates between a kind of 9-square organization and a 4-square organization. And that's made even more ambiguous through the barrel vaults, but also planes or slope planes that tilt from the center to the periphery. So these are the two vaults. These are the walls that support that subdivide the rooms, but also support the house structurally. And then these are the kind of tilted slope planes between the structural pier walls. And so we were really interested in kind of playing with this idea of a kind of like a thick surface and a thick and like a volume that's sandwiched between that thick surface, and trying to oscillate between those two worlds from looking at it from the short elevation versus the long elevation. This is the plan of the house, so it's kind of organized in 4 quadrants, with the two vaults down the central spine, and they intersect in the center at a foyer. And that was a kind of space to kind of, given that the house is so kind of introverted and kind of segmented in kind of quadrants, that the foyer is a kind of space where sight lines are kind of like more leaky visually. And so this is kind of coming in the entryway. These are the spaces of the barrel vaults, which house supporting programs like a study or storage. And this is looking the other way at the foyer, where the client wanted the studio space, which is in the lower right quadrant of the plan, be integrated into the house. This project, this was something that we did not get, but nevertheless led to a set of research that is still ongoing, and it has been quite fun to work on. We were invited to think about a house for two brothers on a estate in upstate New York. They call the estate the Art Farm, and it houses large-scale commissioned pieces of art by artists that we all know and love. And they wanted the house for themselves and their families, and they wanted to be together because they're very close in age, yet they wanted some degree of separation because they're not always so nice to each other. So we, this is the main house here. This was designed by OIII Works some time ago, but the idea of a landscape that houses art also meant that the architecture wanted to kind of participate in being a kind of bespoke artifact. So this house actually has the ability to kind of have mirrored projections on it at nighttime. This was the site plan. That's the main residence. And actually they wanted to kind of be out of the way if so many tours happened on the site. They wanted to kind of be in the forest, in a kind of clearing. And the landscape architect produced the strategy of producing roomness outside by making these kind of circular clearings that would bring light into the forest. So you'll be in a kind of dense brush, and then things will kind of open up into these circular or semicircular landscape forms. So we produced a series of studies thinking about the ways in which we can separate and conjoin the two residences for the families, and also articulate for them where collective spaces might be, or shared spaces might be. I think that was one of the benefits of of having a house together is that they don't have to have two houses with the same set of functions. So where's the things that they can share together? So here, the top left, thinking about two houses that are on two sides of the gable, separated by a threshold that goes into the central courtyard, and that the circular figure is where all the collective spaces are. The kind of U-shaped figure was trying to think about how can we use the kind of topography of the site to think about section. So rather than having them on the same level, could they be separated and then conjoined by a hinge where all the collective spaces are stepping? So you get the idea. We didn't get that, but we were also trying to articulate, because there's a very tight budget, how might we build a curved form, which is something they desired, out of flat parts or through efficient means. And so we did a series of diagrams of thinking about how we might subdivide a circle simply, radially. You can subdivide it Cartesianly, or you can pack regular orthogonal things inside the perimeter of the curved things. So we have tangent boxes 1, where the boxes are in the inner and outer circle, but are different sizes, or the second one where they're all self-similar. And then the kind of perceptual effects between a round form, looking away from the center versus looking towards it. So yeah, we didn't get that project, but it made us think about this question of roundness and how might we tackle that through a logic of tectonic or material construction. And that led to the round house, where we were exploring questions of mass timber through fresh skins in combination with CLT. And we started the process by thinking about how to stiffen the surface through folding. And in this case, we were really interested in kind of a logic of curved crease folding. And so we started with the idea of, how can we make a kind of abstract geometry feel slightly familiar by folding it to produce something that looks like gables, but it's not quite gables. And we did that 3 times. And then we intersected those folds, or we took a section of those folds, and then we extended those to produce planar folds. And through that process, you can also get a lot of kind of graphic patternings on the surface of the folded cone. So we're really also excited by the idea of a kind of like graphic plan, or that the idea of the root plan might suggest the plan. And did a series of iterations. This is just a small set of those, but decided to end on one that, had a kind of concentrated intensities that were kind of rotationally symmetrical. And so this is the process kind of rendered. That's the original cone, that's the folded cone, and then that's the final product where both the planar folds and the curved folds are conjoined together to produce a kind of composite figure. And so the interlocking of the 2 sides in plan also sets up, organizes certain kinds of relationships between the public programs versus the private programs. This is the plan here, where there's living functions, private functions, and the more cellular spaces, and then the courtyard that's at the center. And so we were looking at stress skin construction, which is essentially a kind of sandwich of lumber between plywood, and its potential to be prefabricated. And so using a kind of low-res craft and material techniques, but having a kind of high degree of fidelity to the original geometry through the prefabrication process. And also trying to get the house to mirror or reflect that idea of the sandwich at the scale of the whole house. And so there's a kind of large scale wraparound porch that becomes another social space for the house, but is in line with the roof above, which overhangs quite a lot, and engages these kind of micro porches that fill out onto it that are connected to rooms. And so these are some images of that we're doing in the office now, trying to think about materiality and scale. We're thinking about a kind of large scale plywood, chunky shingle that slightly breaks as it curves. And these are a couple images of the courtyard from one end and then the other. And we tweaked the courtyard in a way that the sidedness of it felt slightly special, in particular for the occupants, even though it was this kind of shared position. And we found that the porches on the outside, because of the scale of the curvature, even though it's a kind of collective space, feels more private because of its adjacency to a room is right next door, versus the courtyard feels very open to public at the center of the house. I'm going to skip this project and move to the last one because I started a little late. But the final project is a pavilion, and that we worked on during the pandemic. It's called Edgar Shed. It was to be built on a site in the Seaport area of Boston, and the only requirement was that for people to kind of safely gather during the pandemic. And so it had to be kind of open. And in thinking about how to produce a piece of architecture in the public realm, and how to engage people when they're so kind of isolated in their homes, how could they collectively gather in a safe way and yet feel comfortable. I kind of returned to two structures that was built by my great-great-grandfather, Edgar Canty, in Elliott, South Carolina. The one on the right is the house that my grandmother grew up in. And the structure on the left was a juke joint that would serve the community. And both have some curious things going on. The kind of splinter columns on the porch on the right of the house. On the left, the asymmetrical gable, the small window under the pitch of that, the seam between the roof and the wall. And so there's so many curious decisions here, but what I took from it was not only some of those formal cues, but the kind of programmatic adjacency of a kind of interior gathering space where music and performance is happening in a kind of modest shed, and the kind of social and porosity of the porch that's so much a part of Southern culture. And our idea was, what if we took a gable and we rotated it so much that one side of it became a facade and the other side opened up to allow it for a space of entry. And the idea was to kind of take that simple figure, but to try to produce variation or subtle differences in plan. And so the gable is supported by two walls that pivot around a kind of central circular interior. One wall is parallel to one edge of the gable, the other one is slightly oblique. So we get what I call these three kind of porch conditions: one that's tilted and perspectival, one that's in the round, and the other one that kind of is in alignment with the roof. And to try to kind of play through certain kinds of socially distant ways of gathering. So in this case, trying to think about it as a kind of space for cocktails, perhaps a space for performance, or just a space to kind of be in contemplation. And so this is a kind of bird's eye view of the proposal. This is a kind of worm's eye view of the proposal. Really thinking about just very humble two-by construction, and just the use of texture and color as a way of making those known materials feel a little special. So the whole thing also, it's a little furry or hairier than some of my other proposals, but really trying to use plywood at the scale of a shingle, an overscaled shingle, and allowing that shingle to kind of fold with the walls, and also to kind of just be exposed so that some of the logic of construction is actually on display for public who may not know anything about architecture, but might understand something about this assembly through the ways in which edges are purposely revealed. This is the other side. We were thinking of a kind of wooden beaded interior for the kind of performance space. And this is the plan. We also were thinking about color as a way of activating it. So here we were looking at a series of kind of bright monotone colors. And then we were looking at multi-tone colors where the sheathing is painted a different color than the shingle, so that that color leaks through the reveals or the seams in a kind of graphic way. Thank you.